In 1980, Reagan returned for a new presidential campaign. He was still calling for welfare reform, but now he was doing so as part of a much broader message. He talked of states' rights and of returning America to a better bygone era. While his message had a powerful appeal, to many African Americans, it seemed like a thinly veiled attack on the progress made since the Civil Rights Movement.
He runs on this campaign that's like, listen, we're gonna actually make America great again, and then implicitly in that is the idea that making America great means we basically have to kind of put black people in their place.
We are taking our country back. We're making it great again. Reagan was setting that tone, and black folk were saying, anytime Whitey Leaf's talking about taking their country back, you know what they mean. They coming at us with intensity.
Reagan made good on his campaign promises by rolling back social programs and making significant spending cuts. His policies had immense consequences for America's already struggling inner cities, as the lack of federal support made the job of black civic leaders all but impossible.
Many of the cities where blacks have become mayors and so forth are nothing but garbage cans. Hell, who wants to be the mayor anyway of a garbage can?
A great deal of the misery that black America is confronted with today has been exacerbated during the past couple of years with the cuts in basic survival programs that poor people and disadvantaged people have come to depend upon.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I'm Michael Brooks. We're broadcasting live from Brooklyn, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Head theoretician David Grishcom.
How's it going?
It's going well. Greetings to comrades, friends, and enemies on this week's TMBS. Eric Turkheimer. He's a behavioral geneticist, professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. We're talking about class and IQ. What are hereditary traits, the moral, policy, quagmire, and opportunity, and the actual conversation of the science of intelligence? Then, independent scholar Nida Khan, she's with us. We're talking about, independent journalist rather, we're talking about, can you be progressive except Palestine anymore? The shrinking opportunity for liberal Democrats, normie progressive Democrats, to say all the right things and be concerned about all the right places except for mass killings in Gaza, plus Donald Trump and rap. It's a thing. Neda used to also be a rap journalist, so we're going to touch on that. Plus, we have a very deserving gulag entrant. And in the post-game, LeBron takes care of business, unions unify in Brazil, and much, much more. Plus, of course, a shout out. But first, let's start with the return to the intellectual dark web. This movement of reifying conventional wisdom and soothing insecurities that is still dominating much of our intellectual, or at least YouTube landscape. Luckily, those are still somewhat different things. And let's start by looking at a couple of different clips of a monk debate that took place last weekend with Michael Eric Dyson and Michelle Goldberg on one side of the political correctness debate. I don't remember, what was the question of the debate, if you could scroll up for me? To be resolved, what you call political correctness, I call progress. Arguing on the side of progress, Michael Eric Dyson and Michelle Goldberg, and arguing on the side of political correctness in a bad sense, Jordan Peterson and Stephen Fry. Now, there's a lot to disaggregate here, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But let's first play the sort of hottest moments of this debate, which really amounted to, in the first instance, Michael Eric Dyson sort of calling Jordan Peterson out for being an angry white man.
I've got a couple of questions.
So let's
Oh, sorry.
folks. I'm going to go to Jordan.
Sorry. Okay, I have the order. Okay, first, Jordan Peterson is going to demand that Michael Eric Dyson quantify his white privilege in specific numeric terms, much in the same way Peterson quantifies in numeric terms dragons when he claims they exist literally. All right, let's play that clip first.
Jordan, then to you,
Let's
Michelle.
assume for a moment that I've benefited from my white privilege. Okay, so let's assume that. That's
a good
fine.
assumption. That's
yeah,
a good
well, that's
assumption.
what you would say. So, so let's say here. Let's get precise about this. Okay.
Was that very individual of you?
Let's get precise about this. Okay.
Let's get precise.
To what degree is my present level of attainment or achievement a consequence of my white privilege? And I don't mean sort of. I mean, do you mean 5%? Do you mean 15%? Do you mean 25%? Do you mean 75%? And what do you propose I do about it? How about a tax? How about a tax that's like specialized for me so that I can account for my damn privilege, so that I can stop hearing about it? Now, let's get precise about one other thing, okay? We'll get precise about one other thing. Now,
Precise.
yeah, precise, yes. And so, if we can agree, and we haven't, that the left can go too far, which it clearly can, then how would my worthy opponents precisely define when the left that they stand for has gone too far? You didn't like equity, equality of outcome. I think that's a great marker. But if you have a better suggestion and won't sidestep the question, so let's figure out how I can dispense with my white privilege, and so that you can tell me when the left has gone too far, since they clearly can. And that's what this debate is about political correctness. It's about the left going too far. And I think it's gone too far in many ways. And I'd like to figure out exactly how and when, so the reasonable left could make its ascendance again and we could quit all this nonsense.
Okay, Michelle, go for it.
Okay, and now we're going to move forward to Michael Eric Dyson's response. We'll just play out these three clips without. Can you get to that relatively quickly? Okay, so there's Jordan Peterson, and bear with us here as we deal with the technicalities of this. Jordan Peterson is outlining his sort of favorite mode of being, which is aggrieved, incredulous, and almost like sort of intentionally angry and naive. So there's a lot more to get to about how we define all of these terms, but let's just be really, really clear. He's negating a reality that is not innovative or dangerous to negate. It's actually a fusion of hard right reactionary politics, because that's actually basically the only people on the map who would deny the basic reality that, of course, having white skin in the United States confers upon it obvious advantage. It takes basic sociological assessment and even more foundational basic moral intuition to understand that. That's what he's attacking. There's nothing profound about this. And then he's trying to sort of bludgeon it into a narrow, quantifiable sense, even though a vast, significant portions of his scholarship would never stand the test of anything so precise, empirical, and rigorous. By the way, we could get into everything from disparate intergenerational wealth to policing in any number of areas to illustrate the point. This is Michael Eric Dyson's response that gets Jordan Peterson very triggered.
I want to come to you on those, great, Michelle, on Jordan's point about how does he, in a sense, get an equal voice in this debate back if it is implied that his participation brings with it this baggage of white privilege that doesn't allow him to see clearly the issues that are before us.
But that is to be complicit in the very problem itself terminologically. You're beginning at a point that's already productive and controversial. You're saying, how can he get his equality back? Who are you talking about? Jordan Peterson, trending #1 on Twitter? Jordan Peterson, with an international bestseller? I want him to tweet something out about me in my book. Jordan Peterson, right? This is what I'm saying to you. Why the rage, bruh? You're doing well, but you're a mean, mad white man, and you're gonna get us right. And I have never seen so much wine and snowflaking. There's enough wine in here to start a vineyard.
So as you could imagine, Jordan Peterson, 10 minutes later, responds or brings this up again with the sort of usual emotional control, sense of decorum, and lack of histrionics or melodrama that you would expect from him. But again, this is a really basic point that Michael Eric Dyson is bringing up here that is like basic foundational literacy in reality. We're not even getting to the broader contradictions of the arguments that are outlined here. We're dealing with basic observable patterns of life with regards to race. And here's Jordan Peterson taking out of it what you, unfortunately, at this point would expect him to take out of it.
Doesn't address the issue in the least. And with regards to my privilege or lack thereof, I mean, I'm not making the case that I haven't had advantages in my life and disadvantages in my life like most people. You don't know anything about my background or where I came from. It doesn't matter to you because fundamentally I'm a mean white man. That's a hell of a thing to say in a debate.
Let me just say.
Very, very brief, because I want to move on to men and women. A good topic next.
The mean, mad white comment was not predicated upon my historical excavation of your past. It's based upon the evident vitriol with which you speak and the denial of a sense of equanimity among combatants in an argument. So I'm saying again, you're a mean, mad white man, and the viciousness is evident.
Okay.
I would actually tend towards sullen bitch white man, but that's just me. Look, there's a lot of difficulties to tease out here. This debate about free speech and political correctness is going to constantly miss each other in many respects because there's a lot of different moving pieces to it. Stephen Fry's arguments in this debate had a lot more to do with sort of emotion and people's sense of sort of ease in communication. He made some very faulty political arguments, but, and I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but the reality is he's, look, he's a privileged actor parodying some easy top lines from newspapers. But his broader takeaway about an ease of communication and an allowing of debate, divergent opinions, and even profoundly wrong ones is actually a good thing. And there is a very worthy conversation and an important one to have about strategy and tactics, things that someone like Angela Nagel identified very effectively in her book, Kill All Normies, which everybody should read. How do we respond to fascist speech? How do we debate? What's the fusion between dealing with bad ideas in good faith versus exposing the monetary roots of bad ideas in society? We can make some very basic distinctions, which Michelle Goldberg made. Don't censor people and don't beat them up for what they say. That seems pretty easy. It wasn't good enough for Peterson. Peterson's point is, of course, its own form of obvious identity politics in a sort of way that is becoming really comical with these people. He does identify with a group. He thinks that young men are really aggrieved and victimized in this society. We can laugh that off, and certainly from a historical and liberal perspective, we can debunk a lot of that. But more broadly, sometimes these people point to problems that are products of late-stage capitalism, not because of lack of beliefs in dragons or the collapse of patriarchy, but because of economic fluidity, lack of ability to properly start a life, lack of economic autonomy. It's very important that on the left, we distinguish between social movement and social progress and the emancipation of all categories of people with the limitless nature of insecurity as defined by modern economic policies. That is right at the heart of the contradiction and the emotionalism that Jordan Peterson is speaking to. And it's very simple. We can never cater to the reactionary sentiment, and we never will, and we would never want to. But we can intervene in the material conditions. That's where we can go. And all this intellectual dark web stuff at the other end, it's like, look, there's also just some hard-earned progress here. For every humorless, stupid response to a stand-up comedy special or the toxicity of internet call-out culture, all of which have been far more powerfully critiqued by the left than any right-wing poser who's created a business model off of themselves by saying they're victimized by college students. The basic ideas that they're putting forth, markets are natural, gender hierarchies are essential, make sense of the problems and conflicts of your life by clinging to old stories and reinforcing traditional hierarchies. This is dangerous stuff? No, it's a lifestyle brand. It's an intellectual movement as prepackaged thought to soothe insecurities and even out rough edges in a world that is changing really, really fast. We need to not fight that change. We need to make sure that the change happens in the right way. That's our task on the actual left. And the final question I do have about this, circling back, and I want people to participate in this. We're doing a new hashtag. It's called Peterson Questions, hashtag Peterson Questions. And my first question, which I tweeted out earlier today before the show, is, since when was being a sullen bitch a vehicle for restoring masculinity? You can tweet out your hashtag Peterson Questions and at TMBS FM or at me, at _ Michael Brooks on Twitter. And I hope that this will open a genuine, sincere inquiry and an open exchange of ideas that will not be shut down by ad hominems. Thank you very much. We're running a little behind, so I think we'll do the shout out actually later. We're going to do a brief pitch, and then we will get to Professor Eric Turkheimer, and I'm going to ask him if, from his perspective as a behavioral geneticist, witches are real. I mean, I will say, it takes a lot of balls to say, you better quantify your experience of racism in strict numeric terms the same week that a New York Times profile, you're like, dragons are real. They're hierarchy dominator. That's a predator and prey. It's a category. You got to admire the brass on that.
Also, they knew about DNA helixes in Mesopotamia. And I can't go into why I know that, but it's true.
Yeah, I received a secret processed information from the alien from the seventh dimension that said that the Aztecs had a perfect understanding of gender hierarchy because they were Aryan. Now, that being said, explain to me mathematically why being Puerto Rican has hurt you.
I saw Clay Pot once that told me that Montezuma knew what the Higgs boson was.
Think about it. That'll blow your mind. Or maybe if you bitches would stop whining and get into the kitchen, boys could throw rocks and masturbate again. Oh, my God. This shit makes me feel like Alex Jones, man. It's all planned. We're not dealing with any serious problems. The globalists have put out some weird histrionic middle-aged college professor to speak to upset young chronic masturbators. It's all a giant distraction from capitalism and actual policy plans. We're playing Biggie. This is Notorious B.I.G. He would have been, I believe, 46 this week. The great. And love this track as always. We continue to grow. Our next goal is to reach our first 2,000 patrons. We've already begun to expand content with Woke Bros, the new show with Big Waz and myself. Check it out. New patrons, as well as all of the many illicit histories and idea primers. New animation, I believe, next week. Right Wing Mandela's radio show. It's coming to you. And we have many more things in the works. So, usually elaborate a little bit more, but this week I just want to thank everybody. Appreciate the growth. We need you to help, continue to sustain what we have, expand what we do, truly independent and accountable to nobody but you. We appreciate it so much. Patreon.com/TMBS. Patreon.com/TMBS. We'll be right back with Professor Eric Turkheimer on The Michael Brooks Show. The Michael Brooks. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Professor Eric Turkheimer. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia, and he has told me, I just want to be transparent about this for everybody watching and listening, that I can call him Eric. So I would like to welcome Eric to the program. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, pleasure. Thanks a lot.
So, you were, let's sort of, I guess, work this backwards. I'll just set up for everybody. You were one of the co-authors of the piece in Vox last year, which took Charles Murray and Sam Harris to task on both the science and actually also the ethics of the bell curve argument. Before we get there, can you explain where you're coming from, both in terms of what you study and also maybe your understanding, because I see so much confusion of this, but like, how would you define what hereditary traits and intelligence from your perspective? Easy stuff.
Well, that's a big question, but I think maybe it's easier to start with the second one and to start with intelligence.
Okay.
And you know, I'm not somebody who's going to come here and say there's no such thing as intelligence or that the construct of human intelligence is entirely wrong. I think intelligence is a real thing, and I think most people can look around them and see that some people nearby that they know are functioning at a higher cognitive level than other people.
Tell me
in
about
a lot of different ways. And we all know that. And more than that, it's true enough that if you give people a bunch of cognitive tests of almost any kind, on average, people who do better on one test are going to tend to do better on another test. They're all going to be positively correlated. And that allows you to do some statistical things of kind of taking an average across all those tests that people tend to do well on. And that's kind of a definition of what an IQ score is. And once you have it, and it's just a measure of how well people can think and how well they can function cognitively in the real world at a particular time. And that is not surprising. That correlates with all sorts of other things in life. People who are good thinkers do better in their jobs, they live longer, they're healthier. So I think all that is true. And I think you can accept all that without going to the next step that I think the harder core IQ people always want to go to, which is to say that this IQ score is not just a measure of how good a thinker you or I are today, but how much inner capacity for thinking you have. You know, that it's something you're born with that tells you how good a thinker you can be, as opposed to what it actually is, which is just a measure of how good a thinker you are. And, go ahead.
No, sorry, please finish.
I sometimes like to compare intelligence and IQ to the construct of health.
Right.
That if you look around, you see that some people around you are healthier than others. And health is a construct that goes together, and people who are healthy in some ways tend on average to be healthy in other ways. Everybody can see that. But we're not tempted to think of health as this deep inner quality that people are born. That guy has a lot of health. That's somebody that we'd like to have in our country with us.
Right.
We recognize that that's an outward quality of people that develops for a lot of reasons. And I think a view of intelligence like that captures a lot of what's good about it. That it's a useful measure for. I mean, if a kid is struggling in school, an intelligence test can give a lot of information about how the kid thinks and what the kid is good at and what the kid is bad at, without making some judgment that the kid has this inner quality that means he or she is not capable of ever functioning at a higher level.
Does that go?
That's my view of IQ.
Right. So it's almost more. So if I understand you correctly, you're saying it's almost more two things. One, that it's almost more analogous to a physical. So if you went to the doctor and, I don't know, you'd just been on the last year, you've basically been on a bender and you're drinking a lot, you're smoking a lot, maybe you live in a neighborhood where there's higher air pollution. Let's, be very clear about these broader contextual influences as well. You're going to get a certain read on your health. In 7 months in a different environment with different practices, your health will change in that physical. Is that the right kind of analogy to draw from what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you want to say that with a recognition that people's health is not an easy thing to change. Mm-hmm. And if somebody's been unhealthy for a long period of time, it's not like you're just going to tune up their daily environment quickly and bingo, they're going to get better. And intelligence is the same way. And that's one of the things that people observe about intelligence that I think tempts them to think as something more inner and permanent about people, that it's not an easy thing to change. And I think that's something we'll get to when we talk more about Murray and Harris and the bell curve and all that. It's not as simple as, oh yeah, that person is not doing very well right now, just tune up his environment and the food he eats and bingo, his IQ goes up 20 points. It's not that easy. But that's true of many human characteristics that once we get to, think about your weight. Once your weight gets to a certain point in life, it's not like you just turn a switch and dial it back, that our human characteristics have a lot of inertia. And I think just it's important now to make the transition and talk about genetics and hereditary traits.
Yeah.
Because the way I just described intelligence might make it sound like I think it's a completely, absolutely environmental thing. And it's in fact not quite that simple. There are standard ways, older ways and newer ways, that scientists have to study the role that genetics plays in human characteristics and particularly in behavior. So I don't know if this is something that you've talked about before, but in the old days, twin studies and that kind of thing. And it's certainly true that identical twins have IQ scores that are more similar than identical twins who are clones of each other, have IQ scores that are more similar than fraternal twins who only share 50% of their DNA. And that tells you that the genes we're born with does have something to do with where we turn out in intelligence. Mm-hmm. But just like you have to kind of put some caveats on the construct of intelligence, you have to put caveats on the construct of heritability. And the big one is that fact I just stated, that people who are more genetically similar turn out to be more similar in IQ, is not some amazing thing that we've discovered to be true for IQ. It's true for everything. It's a characteristic of human beings and probably organisms that develop on their own and guide their own development. So if my standard example is marital status, if you have an identical twin who's been divorced, you're much more likely to be divorced yourself than if you have a fraternal twin, a dizygotic twin, who's divorced. Mm-hmm. And that's because even though there are no genes for divorce, nothing even resembling genes for divorce, it's a very complicated process that leads people to their eventual marital status. And at the end of the day, the genes you're born with, one way or another, wind up correlated with the probability that you're going to wind up single or married or divorced or whatever. And when you look at it that way, it's not a particularly scary fact. I mean, it seems sort of obvious. It's kind of the the acorn doesn't fall far from the tree.
Is it almost like nature via nurture? Like, I guess when I read, correct me if I'm wrong, but I just want to ground the concept. From reading you, my understanding was, and I forget the language you use specifically, but you've objected to genetic determinism as well as sort of an pure environmental influence. But part of your critique is that a lot of other people, or maybe not even necessarily, let the ways in which those two things interact in and of themselves is already so sort of, I don't know what the right word is, but integrated or interdependent, that even once you get into the terrain of sort of roughly distinguishing what is nature, what is nurture, what's innate, what's environmental, you're already sort of on a bit more shaky ground because these two things are constantly interacting with each other.
Yes, and that has the result of making any complex outcome in people almost impossible to predict.
Right.
So even identical twins, depending on exactly how you figure it, there are 10 or 15 or 20% of identical twin pairs who differ by 15 IQ points, which is, I forget that, I don't know, again, how much everybody knows about the way IQ is scaled. The standard deviation of IQ is about 15 points. 15 points is a big difference.
Right.
And even people, these are clones of each other. And they head out into the world and bounce off all the things that happen to them in the course of their life. And people can wind up very, very, very different. And that now, are identical twins more similar to each other on average than random people? Yeah. Yeah, they sure are. But they're very different. And it's not really very possible to predict from the genes you're born with what your IQ is going to be. I mean, there's some new technology on that we could talk about, but
I want to get to some of your research that has been very interesting to me. Maybe we could explain it and then use that as a sort of doorway to get to the specifics of the problems with Murray, scientifically and ethically.
Mm-hmm.
But you wrote, and I believe this is a paper from 2011, you were a co-author of a piece called Socioeconomic Status Modifies Heritability of IQ in Young Children. And my understanding, and again, please bear with me, is that essentially, and we've already kind of established that it's not as neat or as clean to distinguish between genetic and environmental factors as people might like it to be, but that if you were going to do that, and you obviously had a methodology for doing that, that basically children from wealthy or affluent families, it was primarily an innate trait. And then people from lower socioeconomic strata, it was highly environmentally influenced in terms of the interventions that came in and affected people's performance. And I think, this also, obviously, I'm on the policy angle, and I see, and I'll just lay my, cards, it's probably not a surprise to you, but it's that it's not just that I think that The Bell Curve is a racist book, which I'll own myself. I do, in fact, think the chapters in question are. But the broader argument is to naturalize a policy set where you don't intervene on social inequities because they're hardwired, supposedly. And your research, it contradicts that science. It also points directly to, different policy sets, if I'm reading it right.
Yeah. Once again, there's a lot there. Let's take that all one at a time. First of all, before we get to the twin study that we did, it's something you hear over and over and over again, but it can't be emphasized enough that heritability pretty much never, ever has anything to do with how changeable a trait is. So, there are a million famous examples of that. If you take height, for example, which under any normal kind of method is a very heritable thing. Anybody can see it. Tall parents have tall kids. But Japanese people the average height of Japanese people has increased 4 or 5 inches since before the Second World War. Or Dutch people were, on average, about 2 to 3 inches shorter than Americans before the Second World War. They're now the tallest European country there is, and 2 inches on average taller than Americans. And so height was heritable back then, it's heritable now. A massive change occurred in between that doesn't have anything to do with genes. It happened because, to the extent it's understood, nutrition changed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one thing. The second thing before we get to the study is that I think heritability, there's a thing called the heritability coefficient, which varies between 0 and 1. And it's a statistic that you can compute. And people get it in their head that it's, 0 means not genetic at all, and 1 means absolutely perfectly genetic. And that's not true in general. And moreover, it's not like traits come with heritabilities that you can discover. Like intelligence has some heritability, and we're going to do this science, and sooner or later find out if it's 0.3 or 0.4 or 0.5 or 0.6. It depends. It depends on a million other things. And that brings us to the study, which basically, well, it showed more or less what you said. You mentioned like effective interventions, and these were just twins. There were no interventions.
Mm-hmm.
But it showed that identical twins in very poor families, identical twins were basically who were genetically identical were no more similar than fraternal twins who were just siblings. And that's a sign that genes don't seem like they're playing a very key role. In middle class and better families, you got the classic result where identical twins were a lot more similar. And just by the way, I mean, full disclosure, that finding has turned out to be reliably true in the United States, where we have a lot of economic inequality. It has not turned out to be so true in Western Europe. But anyway, what it suggests that I think that makes perfect sense to me is that the effect of the environment, which is a very broad construct, on intelligence isn't a linear thing. That bad environments have much more of a negative effect on people than differences among good environments have a positive effect, at least on their IQ scores. IQ is not the beginning and end of the world. So, it may not make much difference if your mom hangs a fancy mobile over your crib when you're little, because the important things that come from a good supportive environment come from elsewhere. But on the
that
other
she
hand,
wants to do it might be the indication.
Yeah,
possibly.
Yeah, it might be an index for a whole lot of other good things that you got in your home.
Right, that's all I'm saying.
Right, that even if it specifically doesn't make any... Yeah. But in any event, I mean, if you look at twins in well-off homes, it's generally true that the individual details of how those homes were good, it's very hard to show that they have much of an effect. There are lots of other reasons to be really nice to your kids if you have the resources, but changing their IQ probably isn't one of them. But on the other hand, it's very easy to show that chaotic, undernourished, bad schools have, really bad and often hard to change once they've happened, effects on intelligence. So, I mean, I think the appealing thing about our result, I mean, we hope it's true, is that it gives you a way to appreciate how important the environment is for children's development without feeling like that you have to completely write off the fact that genes play a role in how people grow up. Genes play a role given that the environment is good enough to support the genetic differences that we all have.
So then, this is a natural transition point in the last section here. Then, specifically, I guess the problems with Murray's argument specifically from your perspective, scholastically, and then finally, then after that, we'll move more broadly into sort of the moral consequences of the kind of cavalier approach that Harris and Murray take.
Yeah. Well, I don't know where to start. I mean, I see the bell curve as, when I sort of discussed the IQ and heritability in the terms of things that I don't think it is, that the hardcore view of IQ is that it's this inborn capacity to think and learn.
Right.
And it's not just an indication of how you're doing, it's what potential do you have, and something that you're born with. And some people are born with more of it than others. And on the other hand, the hardcore view of heritability is that it's a set of genes that you're born with that's going to determine what you're going to become. And I think both of those are wrong. They're overstated. They take something that's not a complete falsehood and overstate them and make them more concrete and deterministic than they actually are. And I think the bell curve, by and large, is an exploration of what it would mean for large-scale social policy if those two things were really literally true. If IQ were a inborn human capacity that was transmitted in the genes from parent to child in a deterministic way. And they showed probably this part, I think the most accurate part of the book is, well, two things. I mean, I have to give the book credit for being a very early documentation of the increase in inequality in America.
Right.
And that's only gotten worse. They're wrong about the reasons for it, I think, but the phenomenon itself is there. And the fact, I think, is true that intelligence is becoming, over generational time, over periods of hundreds of years, is becoming a much more important characteristic for people.
Right.
That it wasn't that long ago that most people were working on farms in rural areas where either practical knowledge of the world or physical strength were really the important qualities. And now that we live in a world where many of us spend almost all of our time in a world of abstraction, abstract thinking has become much more important, and it's changed the way people think. So all those things are true. And I mean, that's the last is an interesting reason why intelligence has been increasing in the world, the Flynn effect. But
will you explain the Flynn effect briefly?
But the Flynn effect, which is actually really important to thinking after James Flynn, who documented it, the Flynn effect is the observation, and it's super important to rebutting the Murray-Harris, if that's what it is exactly, view of IQ. It's the observation that the average level of IQ in society over as long as they've been giving IQ tests to people that allow us to compare over time, which is maybe 100 years or so or a little bit more, has gone up dramatically. It's exactly like those Japanese and Dutch people that I talked about, that people, average IQ nowadays is maybe 15 points higher at least than it was during World War I, which is no time at all. It's a huge change that obviously is not driven by people's genes haven't changed in the last 100 years. And that shows so clearly that IQ is totally malleable environmentally.
Right.
And that fact all by itself makes it so hard, impossible, in my view, to look at some group of people, poor people, or some racial group or some national group, wherever you want, who right now have IQ scores that are lower than well-off European or Asian people, and say, that's it, it's fixed in their genomes, there's nothing you can do about it. How can that be true? How could you know that to be true in a world in which the average IQ, almost everywhere anybody's looked, has gone up by more than that in the last 100 years?
Right. And I mean, what then, briefly then, you did talk about in the initial Vox piece, the original Vox piece, the moral consequences. And I want to just put on the table a distinction I would make, and you could, obviously agree or not. I think, in Murray's case, there's clearly, he's a policy guy, and he might be, he might have a good, quantitative methods or whatever, but just as he's pivoted from these sort of innate trait racist or race-based arguments, I would say racist, to be transparent. His recent books are all about the white working class's collapse of moral standards, and that's become a sort of cultural argument. And I think you're right. He actually documents inequality really well, and then he's looking for reasons that are, outside of, basically having an unregulated market and non-redistributive policies. I mean, that creates inequality. So, but he's making a policy argument there that, genes determine intelligence.
And when you read the bell curve, it's a good third of it is about social policy,
right,
and about his doubts about intervention programs that are supposed to improve people's cognitive function, or public assistance and welfare programs. And he has a very clear, which he's entitled to, a very clear set of policies that he believes in.
But just to be clear, I just want to add this quote in it, because I just want people to really understand. And I don't remember whether this quote is from the bell curve itself or not, but there's a Murray quote that I'm going to paraphrase. He said something to the effect of, by the 70s, with the discrimination, legal discrimination getting taken off of the books, and with programs like Head Start, he said you pretty much took all of the juice out of the environmental questions. Now, in the context, I obviously, object to that on any number of historical or policy grounds, but even in light of the science you're talking about and the sort of long range of these things, that does not fit.
Yeah, I mean, Head Start is a really good thing, but it's a very limited program. You're taking kids a few hours a day out of very difficult circumstances for a relatively short period of time and doing what you can with them. And then they go right back where they were. And,
right,
what the data on those kind of interventions show is that they help while the kids are in them. And then once the kids go back to the whatever negative circumstances they came from, they have a tendency over time to revert, which is not very surprising to me. And I just, it's, well, just before, because I was going to go to race, and I think just before you do that, it's worth pausing for a minute to talk about the role of race in the bell curve, because that's something that came up in Harrison Murray, and I know it's a standard for Charles Murray that he thinks he's treated unfairly because, in his view, race plays a fairly minor role, though it's in fact the subject of 2 chapters of the book. But I think it's true enough that I don't really think it matters very much for what you say or think. But I think Murray's concerns as a person are more with class than they are with race, and that explains why most of his subsequent books have been much more about social class than they are about race. But I don't really think the issues are very different. That if you think that poor people are poor because they inherit genes for low IQ and their low IQs determine that they're poor, well, it's not that different than thinking that about some ethnic group. It's
right,
basically the same argument. It's a matter of who you're applying it to.
Right.
And, well, I mean, maybe we should talk a little bit about Murray and Harris.
Yeah, I would like you the sort of you did talk about the moral costs of this sort of discourse. So maybe, take it whatever way you want in the last couple of minutes.
Yeah, I think what I really didn't like about it is that I don't think there's any scientific basis for speculating that some groups, whatever kind of groups of people you want to say, that some groups of people have genetically determined lower IQs. And what I found objectionable, in some ways, in particular, coming from Sam Harris, was the kind of casual way that it was presented, as though that conclusion, that groups of people have fixed lower IQs, is just sort of a natural conclusion that any sensible person would draw. And that, hey, look, things in the world are heritable. Height's heritable, IQ's heritable. We know that. Then you look at groups of people, there's differences in their IQ scores. Hey, they ought to be heritable too. Why wouldn't they? And, it's only if you're some kind of snowflake liberal who can't take the truth that you'd want to shrink from that obvious biological fact that people differ biologically, which obviously they do, and that those biological differences determine our behavior. And to me, that's taking, one of the most profound and loaded scientific controversies of our era and throwing it as a toss-off. It's like, you don't even have to think about this. It's obviously true. And A, it's not obviously true. And B, I think it's especially wrong to speculate about things that harm people, that really truly have the power to harm people in a lot of ways. If this were some, one of the studies I've done about people's performance on personality scales, and you have some interesting psychological theory about it, and somebody wants to speculate one way or the other, fine. Scientists do that. But we're speculating about the ability to function cognitively of whole groups of people, and that's just not something to do lightly. And I think all of that horror, that after we wrote this piece of, oh my God, how can they be criticizing this scientific work, is ridiculous. You don't speculate loosely about really negative things and then be shocked when people are sort of horrified to hear you do it.
Yeah. I think that you just captured it perfectly. And I think especially in some, I see, Murray is, I basically, if I'm being transparent, I don't have enough negative things to say about him, but he's a political opponent and we're in a political contest. That sort of blasé way that Harris waded into it was, first of all, obviously was incredibly arrogant. And that maybe that's the last thing to touch on that we need to clear up out of this mess, which is one of the words he likes. What do you make of, in addition to the last question I have for you, in addition to the moral consequences, his assertion, and as someone totally outside of the field, that he represents a consensus and that you and your co-authors who are in the field, tenured professors in this world, are fringe. That was a real interesting PR tactic.
It's really, the simple answer is he doesn't know what he's talking about. Now, are there serious scientists out there who believe in the bell curve? Yes, there are. And I don't want to sell the opposite point of view.
Right.
The fact of the bell curve is that it's controversial, and there are serious scientists on both sides, on even more than both sides. There are people who are more anti-intelligence and more anti-heritability than I am.
Right.
There are people like me. There are people who think, well, I'm not willing to go to all the conclusions that the bell curve reached, but I think it's worth considering. And then there are people who think that the bell curve was mamby-pamby, and you have to go much farther than that. And there are all sorts of points of view out there, and those things have to be argued on the merits, which is exactly what we on the scientific left have been accused of not wanting to do. You know, everybody's always saying, oh, liberals are afraid to talk about race and afraid to talk about genetics. And in the Vox article, we showed up and we talked about the science of race and genetics and said they were wrong about it. And there's this tone of, oh my God, how can you criticize us for doing this science?
Right.
And so, I mean, I don't want to take up more time than I have, but I think an important message for the left here, if I may,
please,
is that it's important to genetics and behavior and intelligence are topics that the right is way more interested in than the left. And I do think it's true that the left tends to shy away from those things. And I am on the left politically, and we need to be willing to think about those things, because the scientific facts, in fact, don't compel any kind of right-wing agenda. I think the scientific facts are, at worst, neutral, and at most support the kind of progressive values that I have. And so I think the intellectual left needs to engage with these things and needs to bring the fight to scientific right and the scientific far right, which is also out there. And there are a lot of us there, but a lot of people keep kind of quiet about it.
Well, that's why you're here tonight. I think you're absolutely right, and I really, really appreciate your work, and hopefully this will be the first of many conversations. Professor Eric Turkheimer, he is a professor of psychology. Thank you so much. He's a professor of psychology at the University of Virginia. Okay, folks, we are bye-bye. We are going to do a brief gulag segment, and then our illustrious guest is here. The very illustrious Nida Khan. Do we have my gulag music ready? I will admit, it obviously does get personal sometimes with Sam Harris when I just hear him saying like he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I'm just like, ding.
Yeah, but now he's sort of shown the jugular. Like, he's fucked up.
Fucked up a lot.
Yeah, he's fucked up.
Well, it's just such a, I mean, I said on Doug Lane's podcast, like Sam Harris, like in the Annie Hall scene, Marshall McLuhan would come out and say, you know nothing of my work. And Sam Harris would say, you're taking yourself out of context to defame me. Okay. There is an incredibly sleazy guy named Sri Thanadar who is running for governor of Michigan. And by the way, there's a real Bernie Krat candidate in that Michigan governor's race who might be on the show soon. This guy, though, Sri Thanadar, is a multimillionaire. He made his money, partially at least, on, what are they, like sex pills that you buy at like a bodega? Like literally, right?
I don't buy them at a bodega.
Matt, you can be honest. So like those basically, like one time Matt came into the office. He's like, dude, you see this? It's Aztec sex secrets. I could go all night long now. And I said, Matt, are you sure that's safe? That looks like it's probably like Chinese knockoff ephedrine. He's like, Chinese knockoff. I don't give a fuck. I'm a Lothario now. So that guy actually made money selling those kind of supplements. He also, I believe, what was the story, David Grisham, about the animal facility?
So basically, he had a testing facility where he had a few hundred beagles
and monkeys,
and also some monkeys.
Right. So two of some of our closest to human animals in existence, and some like incredibly adorable dogs.
So adorable animals that are close cousins,
right?
Hanging out,
right?
Man's best friend and his cousin,
right? Like exactly, right. And how did he treat man's best friend and his cousin?
Well, he ran into some financial trouble, and they had to shutter down the facility. So they locked the doors, and Basically, these animals were left inside without any supervision or access to food. Though, luckily or allegedly, some employees were scaling the fence to feed the animals periodically.
But not him.
Definitely
not him.
Not him.
You think he strolled by them like he's smoking cigarettes? Like, sorry guys,
well, he was
buying less dick pills at Exxon Mobil, so you're gonna
pills.
need to starve.
Can you imagine walking past a building that you're sort of responsible for and be like, there's like a 100 or so monkeys and beagles in there that are just like starving to death?
Well, if you were any of us in this room, you would be appalled. But if you were Shri Thanadar, what you might do is schedule meetings with a couple of political consultants in the state of Michigan, where you have conversations about a gubernatorial run where you're pretty open that you don't know what party you're going to run as. But one of the things that apparently you are pretty open about is that you don't particularly like Bernie Sanders. So basically, yeah. Joe DeSano, this is from a report in The Intercept, who runs a Michigan-based consulting firm, DeSano Strategies, told The Intercept that he met with Thanadar in January 2017 before he announced his bid for governor. Shri didn't know what party banner to run under, but he was certainly running, DeSano said. Mark Heckel, okay, right. Oh, yeah. I told him, even if I was free to help, this is still DeSano, if he ran as a Republican. I offered to help him work through the process if he ran as a Democrat. He agreed to run as a Democrat, but it wasn't until well into February 2017. Initially, he was playing with the idea of running as an independent. I pointed out in Michigan that it's almost impossible statewide. Finally, I ran some numbers showing him the futility of running as an independent. Now, I don't care about being a Democrat or any of that shit. I'm just saying that a guy who up until like almost a year ago was still thinking that he might run as a Republican, now portraying himself as a fiscally savvy Bernie, quote unquote, might be a little bit dishonest. Now, there is an actual left candidate, Abdul El Sayed, who's the Detroit public health chief, who has a real left record, and you can actually trust on these things, and also didn't have a bodega sex bill business and probably lead to the harm of man's best friend and his cousin. So today's gulag, Shri Thanadar. And in lieu of the gulag, which obviously is a much longer term project that we're all involved with, you could at least make sure that he doesn't get the Michigan Party Democratic nomination for governor and vote instead for an actual left candidate, Abdul El Sayed. Thank you. What's this music? I like it.
Khmer Rouge.
Khmer Rouge. So fucked up. I love it. I did Blogging Heads with Robert Wright, and I had a great time. And there's a lot of, there's definitely a lot of logic lords in that audience. And one of the comments I saw was like, I looked this guy up, and he's real left with gulag jokes and everything. Don't think I'll be watching anymore. Okay, we're going to take a really brief break, and then we will be here with Nida Khan. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now, return guest. Pleasure to have her, Nida Khan.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming back.
I am a return guest. That's right.
It's a pleasure having you back. You forgot?
I know.
You had such a good time.
It's been too long. I did. We had a good conversation.
We did.
It's always fun.
It's always fun. And I'll try to not get you in trouble this time.
Okay, thank you.
Where have you been writing for recently? What's going on?
Actually, I took a little bit of a break for about a month and a half, and I took on an editing project, which, as you know, is way worse than writing. Just entails a lot.
So my
of
editors tell me.
Right. Editing, honestly, I mean, kudos to all the editors out there because it is so much work and just exhausting. But it needed to be done, so I got it done. Glad that's over with. And now back to focusing on writing again. I had a piece, I want to say a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, on the Iran deal, and that was for actually a radio station based out in Philadelphia, WURD. So I do some work with them.
WURD.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, let's touch on that for a minute. I mean, we've talked about it a lot on this show. Obviously, I mean, it's a disaster. We did an illicit history on the sort of history of Iran, of the sort of fear-mongering and alarmism about Iran. But I mean, what's your read on it? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, well, the title of my piece was, if you want to know what the deal is about, just look towards Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Right.
Because that's basically what it boils down to. And It's interesting because both of those countries, they purport to be the leaders of two of the major religions in the world, but yet their interests are so aligned more than ever before. And one needs to only look at places like Yemen or Syria. And I delved into this in the piece where, you have to kind of step back and also look what we are doing in regards to that entire situation as well. Like, obviously, our interests are aligned with Israel and Saudi Arabia as well. But, we're funding the proxy war in Yemen, where Yemen, I mean, it's literally the worst humanitarian crisis right now on the planet. And there's hardly any focus on it.
Right.
And you have the most wealthy nation in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, literally bombing the poorest country in the region. And you have, I think it's like 1 million cases of cholera. You have millions of kids that are dying, 18 million that are food deprived, basically. And it's just a horrible, horrible situation. But that's what the entire Iran deal is about because, or I should say Trump withdrawing from the Iran deal is about because it's an attempt to stop Iran's influence in the region. So it's not, when there were so many people who were saying that, oh, this is just about undoing everything Obama did. And while, yes, that may have been part of the impetus for him, it's a lot more complex than just that. And unfortunately, people here are oftentimes, this, Michael, are so isolated in terms of information about what goes on around the world that they have no concept of that. They don't even have any idea of half the stuff that we're involved in as a country around the world.
Oh, probably not even like a fourth. I mean, so you think that, no, I think that that's the right read. And I want, one distinction that I draw, which illustrates your point, is the Obama administration started the U.S. support for the Saudi war in Yemen. And for people to know, just a little background, like there's this group called the Houthis, which the Saudis say are a Iranian proxy.
Right.
They might be now,
right.
but they were not historically. They're an organic group. And the Saudis and their obsession with fighting Iranian influence and reasserting regional hegemony have been just unleashed just one of the most brutal daily crimes committed wars since I think now 2014 we're going back to now at the Saudi.
I believe it started 2015.
2015.
Yeah.
2015 bombardment of Yemen. And my read of the Obama administration was that they were sort of like, we've made the Saudis so angry that like we'll refuel your flights and let you demolish Yemen to like give you one. So you complain less. I really think that, it really was how I read that. And then I think you're right with Trump. The distinction is they've actually amped up even more support for what's happening in Yemen.
Absolutely.
And then the distinction, and then we're going to synchronize it with claw Iran back. And that's the other kind of uncomfortable thing for people to contemplate here. There's a lot of areas, and I mean this in a totally morally neutral way. Like I think any people like kind of excuse making or trying to like rub Assad's record. I mean, I'm very clear about that. I think it's totally disgusting. at the same time, I mean, the United States and Iran, from a very like realist perspective, share way more interest in the Middle East right now than in Saudi Arabia. There's no comparison.
Well, I mean, if you look at something like Syria itself, like you said, granted, most of the civilians have been killed by the Assad regime, according to a million organizations.
Every independent monitor says that.
But there are actually 16 international powers that have either bombed or done something in that country as well, including us. We've also killed thousands of civilians as well. Definitely. And then remember, these are then the civilians that are banned on the Muslim ban that Trump has passed. Same thing with Yemen. So, we purport to care about the civilians, but they're the ones who are suffering the most. And I said this in my piece, Saudi Arabia claims that they're fighting the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels, but it's primarily the civilians that are being killed. And we're talking about at weddings, even at funerals, hospitals,
bombed
all
a lot
kinds
of
atrocities that are taking place. And there's practically zero coverage. I shouldn't say zero. There is some coverage of it, but very, very limited here in our media.
And it's also covered, Adam Curtis has the phrase, oh dearism. He did a little mini documentary on sort of like disembodied crises, sort of like a news thing of like, oh dear, how did that happen? Mm-hmm. So even some of the coverage of Yemen is just sort of like, well, here's this really mysterious conflict that you can't completely understand, and the Saudis are our buddies, and maybe they're being a little mean, and what are you going to do? Not every single day the United States and the United Kingdom are refueling jets and a daily
and supplying weaponry
and running diplomatic interference for a daily mass murder.
Right. Actually, it's funny because it was passed, I should say, the billions arms deal when MBS, as he's referred, the Crown Prince, I should say, people love to make him people like to purport him to be some sort of progressive, whatever, because remember, they were going to allow women to drive, in 2018.
Arrested 10.
Right, which I was just going to say, arrested. No worries. Yeah. We're on the same page. Where they actually just arrested, all the women who were pushing for that to happen. So on the one hand,
the 10 leading activists for getting rid of the driving ban, which he just did a whole PR campaign with a couple weeks ago, just got arrested.
Right. So when he was here in March on that PR campaign, he met with Trump, with business leaders around the country, and also AIPAC.
Went to Starbucks with Bloomberg.
Also met with AIPAC. And then while he was here, this is when they passed approved the $1 billion in arms deal to that country. And at the same time, I was pointing this out in my piece, where you have in Israel, where Netanyahu is, or I should say how he's moved to the right is something that Trump can only dream of. And in that country as well, they just passed legislation saying that the prime minister and the defense minister can go to war without larger cabinet approval. So basically they can start a war without any sort of checks or balances over there. And that is a very dangerous dynamic in an already volatile region in the world.
There's no doubt about it. And I think actually in some ways, like Israel's turn to the ultra far right, which has been in the process of happening for several years. And I make a distinction. Obviously, they've had an occupation since '67, and obviously more centrist Israeli governments have certainly, engaged in occupation and so on. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, if we're being real, there's a difference between a country that is threading a contradiction between being an occupying colonial power but also wanting to be a liberal democracy versus what it's turning into, which is like, we're just going to be the colonized, we're just going to essentially be a far-right ethno-state, which is where it's heading and has been headed for quite some time. Do you think, and you're somebody who's obviously on the dial of all of these intersections and has been involved.
I try to be.
You have been, and literally. It struck me, it's been morally untenable for a long time. I used to have conversations even 4 or 5 years ago where it's just dude, you're asking me to check my politics at the door. I'm a critic of Israel for the same reason that I, want criminal justice to radically change.
We had a conversation about this in 2014. After that, all those civilians were killed during that horrible time. We did a whole show on it, I remember, after I did that piece.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But do you think even relative to then that basically the kind of position, not socialists like me or us, But
I don't know if I'm a socialist.
Well,
I haven't.
You're
you know.
okay, like me.
I'm a liberal. Absolutely.
You are a liberal. But do you think that kind of like, Kamala Harris just had this picture going around Twitter of her grinning with Bibi. How does that work for woke 2020?
Right.
We would have looked the other way. And look, Bill de Blasio was my preferred candidate for mayor in 2013. He was the only one on tap with an even remotely approaching any type of agenda that needed to happen. His position on, it's standard New York State.
Yeah.
It's terrible. Is that less tenable than it used to be?
And just to emphasize that point, one of the first people, who, even with the BDS movement, it was Cuomo, who a couple years ago was like, I'm the first governor who's going to sign an executive order saying that if you do any sort of BDS movement, we're going to put you basically on a list, like a blacklist.
From doing state contracts.
Right.
Where is the intellectual dark web? This violation
Where
of free
is the
speech.
nuanced conversation?
Oh my God!
And you know what? And you bring up a great point, Michael, because it is the one thing, even in so-called "quote unquote" progressive circles or any sort of democratic forum, it's the one thing that you cannot talk about, or it's the one thing that there's not enough of a diversity of opinions. Even look at something like the New York Times and all the op-eds that came out with this latest, horror that happened with Israel. And from Bari Weiss to the other guy, just justifying.
Thomas Friedman poetically saying Hamas offered some of the best, like the flower of their youth of Gaza.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And then there was another.
There was one group that committed mass murder.
Right. And
in Gaza. Let's be very clear about that.
I can't remember the other writer's name, but there was another op-ed.
Bret Stephens, when we start blaming the Palestinians or something.
No, I can't remember. I'll look it up.
Probably many.
During the break. There were several. And he basically said, Israel has to defend itself by any means necessary. Right. So it's like almost a move even more, I would say it's even less progressive or less diverse. It's almost doubling down in Trump fashion in that, no, these are the only voices that are going to get out on that. And even my, just one quick thing, even my piece, like I had editors, I won't name where, but once they saw what I actually wrote, they stopped responding to my emails. Initially, they were all interested. And once I actually sent the piece, not even a no, thank you, we're not interested. And WURD, to their credit, was the only place that was like, we'll take it, absolutely.
But, so I think you're totally right in terms of like, and the New York Times editorial page is a major deal, of course. But do you think amongst like people in our cohort and younger, and this is just me being anecdotal, but I feel like for normal people, that tension, that complete inability to reconcile, to be progressive, accept Palestine, it is starting to die in the normal discourse. And that is why when some freak like Barry Weiss tweets something out, that, oh, this is such a bummer, Hamas shouldn't have done this or whatever the propaganda is, a lot of the social media feedback is enough.
Right.
And, Bernie's, again, I agree from a substantive point, whatever, we can critique this or that, but he is the one is like the clearest leader.
Absolutely.
He is the national leader of any type of actual center-left politics.
And honestly,
and he's actually moved on that issue.
Honestly, I think that's why the Democratic establishment had such issues with him, because he is so progressive on those things. And I remember even when, what's his name, Keith Ellison, when he was trying to, run
lead
for
the
the DNC, people like Dershowitz and everybody were like, well, if he gets in, I'm going to leave the Democratic Party. So there was a lot of pushback from the establishment. I think I agree with you that from a younger perspective, young people absolutely are much more on the same page that we are. And there's actually been studies and polls done on this as well, too. And I should say people in Israel and here both are much more progressive on this issue, but we don't necessarily have the power.
Right. No, I think it is. But I think there's a lot of issues today, actually, where it's very disturbing, it's very stark, but there's an advantage to peel a layer of bullshit and just be like, like the reason we support Israeli apartheid is because of power, right? Like we're getting rid of all this nonsense, right? Like this is the issue. It's a fundamental asymmetry. Obviously, look, of course I loathe Hamas. I loathe Hamas for any number of reasons, from the fact that they have engaged in terrorism to the fact that they're a right-wing religious party.
Right.
It's not my politics, but that this is just a fundamental asymmetry in power. And, your tax dollars and whatever, I don't even particularly like that frame, but it's true, is supporting, this occupation and siege on Gaza and all of these atrocities. And any normal person, including many of obviously normal Jewish people, want to change that. And the reason it won't is because of just raw power. Absolutely. And I think like with the inequality debate and a lot of other things, there's something really disturbing but clarifying about that, where it's like,
absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. And you can, they're not diametrically opposed. You can denounce and hate terrorist organizations, and you can denounce governments that also terror and kill people and say, I don't want my tax dollars funding this. So those, you can have those two thoughts at the same time, right? Can you imagine, right?
You can also like criticize murdering people at the border and condemn anti-Semitism, right? Somehow we were just able to do that.
It's amazing.
It's amazing what we're able to pull off. I mean, you and I are a dynamic duo, though, to be fair to other people. You also have a background as a lady of the hip-hop world.
A lady of the hip hop world. Ooh, I like that one.
You like that? It's pretty good.
Yeah, in my former life. I feel like now lately I feel like an old lady who doesn't listen to anything. I feel like
do you like any what about Future? You like Future?
Oh, not really.
You like Ray I'm forgetting that. Ray Strummin? You don't like them?
No. I'll say like Kendrick
You like
Lamar.
Migos. Of course you like Kendrick.
Right.
Kendrick's
like all
conscious.
Exactly.
That
Basically
count.
that's where I'm at.
Do you like Migos? Do you like Migos?
Doesn't really do anything for me.
Wow.
I told you.
I know you like Lil Yachty.
Oh, yeah.
You text me all the time. I love
all
that.
Day long.
By the way, that interview with Joe Budden and Lil Yachty, I rewatched that again recently. It's awesome.
Oh, my God.
He's just like, I don't get sad. Joe Budden's like, you do get sad. You do get upset. I love Joe Budden, man.
It's so funny because as I always joke and say, like, in my former life, I used to write about hip hop and music. And now I'm like, I can't even imagine because all I write about is politics and news now. It's like two totally different lives here.
But oh, board please.
Oh.
But are they? We've come across, this was a video. I did just want to get your thoughts on this. This came out in 2016, but we haven't had a chance to talk about it. I didn't think we covered it at the time.
Here we go.
Huffington Post put together this montage, and I don't know, and I'm ashamed to see some people who made this list. I don't know how long we'll go through it.
I think Nas was on the list. We're both Nas fans.
Yes, this goes back to the 80s. This is like every single, and we could throw it up on screen and play this. Just go through some of it, like Trump references in hip hop.
I'm just trying to get rich like Trump.
In hot pursuit of Donald Trump rap loop.
Niggas always expect to see us two together stable. The best couple they seen since Trump and Marla Mabel.
Oh, no.
Not because his occupation is cause we respect his cake.
I bring your ass over the hump. We trying to get money so we can be living like
Trump talk, real estate stocks and
bonds. All right, that makes sense.
Buy cars with straight cash, have meetings with Donald Trump.
I forgot
I
forgot how wrong Ludacris's covers were.
Throwing it like Donald Trump. I throw my way like Sherman Crump. I got a hold of my state like Donald Trump. 27 cars in a 12-bedroom house. Now they call me Snoopy Trump. I'm Donald Trump with raccoon hairdos. I'm Donald Trump in a white tee and white ones.
This has gone from 1988 to 2005. Even fucking Sean Paul.
Sean Paul.
I'm like Trump and nigga Prentice, only fire at night. Resurrection of the real time to get rich.
All right, Rick Ross gets a pass. What do you think? Yeah, two more. AZ? That was all right.
Next time you see me, I have money like Donald Trump. Give me
Hey, Kendrick Lamar.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, finish that out.
Nigga, next time you see me, I have money like Donald Trump. Give me fame and fortune, me and Trump on golf courses. Homies on the block.
Oh, man.
It was 2009. He's very
Kendrick.
young. All right. But I mean, Trump is kind of like a messy gangster rapper.
I would definitely not say that.
I would.
This just goes to show. Okay, so actually, let's take it back. So,
Yes.
as true hip hop fans that we
Yeah.
both are, hip hop heads, if you look at the origins and basis of hip hop, it was about being socially conscious, about raising awareness, being a voice for the voiceless, and reflecting society where it was. But when you saw this transition where it started turning into more materialism and glorifying that stuff and about wealth, that's where you see a lot of these lyrics coming in. And for better or worse, I guess we should say that Trump during a long period of time symbolized wealth, even though he may not necessarily have had all the wealth that he purports to have.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he was, but again, like a rapper lying about their record contract.
I was just going to say.
A rapper just got leased like a Jaguar and is saying they're worth $30 million. That sounds like Trump.
Yeah. And there's so many, that was part of the industry facade where, acting like you have a ton of wealth, and a lot of times a lot of them didn't. There were even, I remember there's photo shoots where cars were rented that actually belonged to other people but were used for the photo shoots for those artists, like all kinds of things to pretend as if you have that, to put that sort of machismo, bravado, whatever. And this is why it was like you said, Trump and that dynamic of it have a lot in common. But to say that Trump is hip-hop is an insult.
I don't think he's hip-hop, but I think here's what I would say. Well, two things, one that's specific to Trump and one that's always struck me is that the hypocrisy of attacking rap music for embracing materialism and violence when it literally tracks, like, yeah, those were the two. Those were the two poles of hip hop, right? It's like we're either going to chronicle neoliberalism and racism and how it affects our community and respond to it politically, or we're going to try to, through our means, win in this economic system,
right?
Of which being ruthless, being cutthroat, glorify. I mean, Donald Trump not only glorifies gangsters, he's been around and moved with gangsters. I mean, pretty much his whole profession, and reportedly in a certain sense. The second thing was in that book, Devil's Bargain, about Bannon and Trump. Trump actually had pretty good, what are the Q ratings, I think? When he was on cable, The Apprentice had a very diverse audience base.
Oh, I'm sure.
And he basically looked at the numbers and realized and was totally willing to kerosene that, because he also saw that the most effective Republican path was pure racism and white identity politics.
Absolutely. And it's, it's disappointing.
So it's all like a New York story in a way.
Oh, it's all of this is, hip hop.
Right.
It did start. It's all a New York story. And it's kind of sad because you remember when the Central Park 5 situation happened, like he took out those full page ads in 4 major papers.
Tell people that story in case they don't know it.
So the Central Park jogger case, what year was it? 1989, I think.
I thought it was 88, but whatever.
Around that time.
Or 89. Yeah.
Where a woman was horribly attacked and raped in Central Park, and these 5 Black and Latino teenagers were kids, you could call them kids, were rounded up. They were in the park that day. They were rounded up, and long story short, they got coerced confessions from these kids without their parents present, and all types of ridiculousness that the police did.
The Post had a headline of them being perp walked that said animals. They were all
they were
under
referred
18
to as
years
wolf
old.
packs, and they were quote unquote wilding in the park. And they ended up
Wilding was like the 1980s version of the knockout game, as far as I could tell. It was just pure racist media mythology.
Yeah, I mean, those words had very clear intentions of what they were doing. And Donald Trump jumped on this and took out 4 full-page ads full page ads in 4 major papers like the Times and everywhere else, stating that he wanted to bring the death penalty back to New York so these kids could basically be killed.
Right.
And these kids ended up serving extensive time. I mean, they lost their prime youth. And in the end, I'm fast forwarding through this long story, but in the end, they were eventually exonerated.
They were exonerated, right.
Yeah, they were through, actually the actual person who did it, Reyes, I forgot his first name, Mateus, I think. He ended up confessing, and then DNA
because he was in jail for another similar crime.
Right.
Yeah,
and
he was a very disturbed person.
Right. He ended up confessing to it, and then DNA evidence also came in later on, and these kids were finally exonerated, now adults. And even after all of that, Donald Trump has never apologized, and he's instead doubled down, saying something to the effect where, they weren't completely innocent, and they must have been doing something wrong in in the park. So the fact that that took place in the 80s and then, through the years, the hip hop community was very well aware of it. And same thing with, the housing discrimination here in New York. Right. So the fact that they still embraced him also bothers me. But, they're artists, and I do believe in artistic expression. So we can have a conversation about it, but at the end of the day, you can say what you want.
Well, there's no doubt about that. Also, the other thing too was to mention is that, and I think under de Blasio, you have to give him, this shouldn't be the type of thing you get credit for, but Bloomberg wouldn't pay them out. Bloomberg's administration. So these guys were falsely imprisoned as teenagers, in a racial New York lynch mob justice situation. They were exonerated by every type of evidence of DNA, confession, all of it, completely exonerated. And then, and I think people forget, these payouts are not just it's not like a win. It's like you've totally destroyed somebody's life, their ability to gain a skill set, start a job, build a career and economy for themselves. So you give them several $1 million because you've snatched their life.
Yeah, you've ruined their lives.
And Michael Bloomberg and his administration would not pay them out.
Yeah, it wasn't
so that's
until
another.
de Blasio
That's just a button. De Blasio did it.
Right.
It's credit where credit's due, but just another button and how just disgusting. And that's Trump through Bloomberg.
Yeah, and I remember I had a conversation with one of them. I can't remember which one now, but he told me that they also were on the the sex offender registry because of that. Talk about your lives being ruined on so many levels. I mean, it's just it's horrible.
I want to do the shout out, and then we will go to the post game. And you follow along with me for the shout out. Yeah, I know you got
I'll
this.
try to follow you.
I want to shout out Donald Trump. Wait, pause it. Donald Trump for making mad C notes.
Oh, no.
Yeah, hip hop.
Here we go.
All right. Now is the shout out. Thank you to DJ Danerky for our new shout out track.
And we're back.
Danerky. I don't want to get greedy, but if Danerky could give us a shout out beat, that would be ill. Top of the line professionals. Let's get to the shout out. Shout out. Creepy. Shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out. This is crazy. Shout out. This is out of control. Shout out. That's creepy. Shout out. That's weird. Creepy. Weird. Crazy. This is crazy. This is out of control. This is weird. Shout out.
Alex Jones really might be the best broadcaster of our lives. This week, we're focusing on the Poor People's Campaign. It's a national call for moral revival. I'm quoting now from their mission statement. For moral revival that has reached out to communities in more than 30 states across this nation. We've met with tens of thousands of people witnessing the strength of their moral courage in trying times. We've gathered testimonies from hundreds of poor people, and we've chronicled their demands for a better society. The following moral agenda is drawn from this deep engagement and commitment to these struggles of the poor and dispossessed, and also grounded in the empirical assessment of how we came to this point today. And they focus on the evils of systemic racism, poverty, ecological devastation, the war economy, and militarism in an integrated campaign that does synthesize empirical research on the state of America's economic, racial, gender realities and ecological realities with, as they said, actually the ground up reflections of people's actual experience on the receiving end of these things. And they've built campaigns around it. And it's exactly the type of way that we need to move today and organize, obviously, to, in smaller ways, democratic wins and to sort of halt Trump at a basic way, but much more fundamentally and structurally in terms of uniting those issues and integrating those policy sets and moral calls. So shout out to them. Do you have anything to add to
and
that?
I was going to say not just Trump, because I think a lot of times we tend to just focus on him because he has made himself the center of endless
I do a
attention,
great job.
which was another
It's
piece
true.
I did.
Right.
You know, a couple months ago for U.S. News and World Report.
It's hip hop.
because-
We here.
Please don't. But you know, but it's so sad because everybody has bought into it. Like
Right.
if you look at the quote unquote news cycle, it's literally just focusing on what did he tweet, who's fighting with who, the infighting within the administration, and then Russia. And there's so many other stories that we're not paying attention to. Like we had a whole conversation about internationally, but even domestically, we're not paying attention to a gazillion things that are impacting people's lives on an every single, you know, daily basis. And they need to get attention. And the media is doing a disservice. So it's like we're involved in this self-inflicted disinformation campaign. I mean, it's just crazy. Like you talk about the dumbing down of society. Like we've turned into his dream of a horrible reality show. And
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
There's a lot more things that I want to include in my reality
I can't. This is too close.
I'm sorry, I know.
This is too close. Too close.
It's the only way I can process it.
I know. But, you know, but something like that.
When do I get to publicly announce my dating my daughter in my reality show?
Oh, God.
What about cutting government red tape for you fucking your daughter?
Oh, God. I can't.
It's red tape. It's red tape. It's totally unfair. I can't love who I want to love.
You got to do the hand gestures, too.
It's just Elton John who gets to love who he wants to love. I don't get to love Ivanka. I'm telling you, I saw an excerpt of the next that Dave Letterman thing on Netflix where he sits down with a beard and interviews people that used to be relevant. A little salty. But the preview of the next one is of Howard Stern. And Howard Stern's just like, Trump was an amazing guest because like he had these really sincere, clearly in his own head, well thought out things that he's like to everybody else. Like he's like, one day he's like, Trump's like, well, you know, like the real beauties are not actresses. And he's like, and then I would say, well, Mr. Trump, like, well, I don't know, Angelina Jolie, she seems pretty beautiful to me. He goes, 7. It's just like a system. And then he would go, and then he's like, and then he would go, and he's like, you want to know the real beauty, Howard? My daughter. And he goes, you just say this
Wait,
stuff.
did that actually happen? He said this?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
And Letterman gets creeped out.
Yeah,
right? Which,
Letterman's just like, ooh.
If you can creep David Letterman out with tales of womanizing or like that sort of subject matter.
I'm going to say that womanizing is different than sexualizing your daughter.
I actually forget what he got in trouble for.
I don't remember either, but I don't think it was daughter related.
No, well.
Yeah,
I think that there is nobody else in public life that was sitting on a couch at Wendy Williams being like, sex. That's what me and my daughter have in common.
Hey,
sex.
If Ivanka worked for me, which she sort of does but doesn't, it would be totally different.
You honestly, you can't make this stuff up.
I just want to walk into her in a dressing room one day. What's wrong with that?
Oh, God.
You know, it's like the system you create where you're so fucking disgusting, where people are just like, all right, let's just absorb all of your other behaviors as a given. But are you really trying to say you want to fuck your daughter, dude? Like, could you at least like not be doing that?
No.
Can we have like a few things that aren't totally stomach churning about you?
But the thing is, like, his supporters don't care. Like,
No, they probably love it.
Well, I wouldn't
So
say
if that was my daughter,
I want.
maybe if that was my daughter, I'd want to do the same thing.
See, now you're stereotyping his supporters.
Yes, I am.
That is just wrong.
It's fun.
But they're okay with giving him a pass, including the evangelicals and including the establishment of the GOP, because they're getting everything they ever wanted.
Right, and that's not a surprise.
I mean, if you look in the first year the first year that he was in office last year, he got 12 circuit court judges approved, the most in the first year than any president ever.
The Pakistani woman said it. Wasn't me. That's what she said. That's what she said. More judges than anyone.
I love how I'm like, what was it, Lady of Hip Hop and the Pakistani woman? Great.
For
great
me, you're the
combination.
lady of hip hop. For Trump, you're the Pakistani woman.
Probably.
Even the Pakistani broad says it. Tons of judges.
I can't.
And she's not my biggest fan. I really have genuinely asked myself when this guy's going to stop being funny. And now it's funny, like in a real, like, it's just like, all right, sure.
It's not
just
even
fucking disgusting. Okay.
To me, it's like, it's not
it
even
always
funny.
Was.
It's not even funny. It's just like,
just
distraction
grotesque.
and whatever. I think it's all a lot of it is very calculated.
We don't talk about
Very
Trump that much on this show, actually. We actually don't, because I agree with you. I think you have to fit it into a much bigger pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of like, Trump serves a lot of different purposes, including for a lot of people, including, I mean, obviously, first and foremost, Republicans. That's no secret. But even more broadly, a really sick system that facilitated him.
Mm-hmm.
All right, folks. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to go to post game in a minute. Thanks to all new patrons. Join today, patreon.com/TMBS. On this past Sunday, we did an illicit history of Tanzanian socialism and the Arusha Declaration. This Sunday, Bill Fletcher Jr. and I, on a kind of a follow-up to that in some respects on the Black Marxist tradition, two woke bros with Big Waz and myself. Next week, on the next illicit history, we're planning even a week out, a follow-up with Professor Mark Blythe. He's back with me, and this time it's only for patrons. Thank you, Nida.
Oh,
See you in
thank
the
you.
post game. You're going to hang out with
Okay,
us.
yes, I
Appreciate
will
it.
stay.
Super producer Matt Leck, head theoretician David Grishcom, super producer David Slavic. He is roaming the digitosphere and with us in the post game. We'll be back here in a few minutes. Thanks, everybody.